In the lead up to the release of Crimson Empire 3, Empire Lost, and Agents of the Empire, two Imperial-centric comic series from Dark Horse, editor Randy Stradley wrote something to tease the new stories which I've always found kind of ridiculous, and which I'd like to thank Dan from Star Wars Centralized for reminding me of. He posted it on Twitter, but I'll link to his YouTube channel in the description. I'll also put up each paragraph on screen to look at, and I'll link to the full text of the original blog post. But essentially, it's about how the Empire wasn't actually all bad, and it opens with saying, quote, "In Star Wars, the Imperials get a bum rap." I would like to make the counterpoint that no, they do not. He acknowledges that the Empire was founded on evil principles, but that Palpatine manipulated the fears, hopes, and ambitions of otherwise good people in the galaxy. But I think it's worth noting that in these stories that he's promoting, and when people say they want stories with the Imperials as protagonists, they tend to not mean they want a story about someone who's being hoodwinked by the Empire into doing its will. They actually want to say that this is a good part of the Empire. If we jump forward a little, Randy described part of the plot of Agent of the Empire, and we run into what's pretty much always the defense for this kind of character. Quote, "With his story set prior to the events in A New Hope, Cross's adversaries are pirates and other criminals, including corrupt Imperials who would manipulate the system for their own gain. This is something you also see Timothy Zahn try to do with Mara in some later stories as well, where they basically say that these weren't the bad Imperials fighting the rebels, you see, these were the ones who would hunt down the corrupt Imperials and the pirates. But it's kind of ridiculous to suggest that the Empire had these two different staff rosters, where one group gets to do the evil stuff, while the other category is kept in the dark and only takes out the targets the Empire has verified to themselves be otherwise evil. As Stradley himself says in the opening, the Empire was founded on evil principles. People like Tarkin, who Randy also acknowledges as being evil, and above all Palpatine, were in fact corrupt, and therefore anything done in the name of the Empire on their policies was furthering that corruption. So why weren't these characters deployed against Tarkin and Palpatine? By the actual Imperial definition, corruption would mean things that disrupt the power of the Empire. For example, a Moff or other official who was trying to subvert Imperial power from within. They would likely be defined as just as corrupt as one who's taking bribes from a local crime boss to use the special governor's bathroom. The sentences to which I object the most come at the end of the first paragraph, though, saying, quote, "But a government that is overtly evil can't sustain itself. You can't oppress the very people who are keeping the machinery running," end quote. So essentially, the argument is that if the Empire were really evil, the government wouldn't have lasted. There are two huge flaws with this premise, and I'll start with the less obvious one. Longevity is not a synonym for morality. There are any number of unjust governments or systems which are able to perpetuate themselves for a long period of time, and that longevity is not evidence that they were good, actually. This feels like a little bit of a weird inversion of the usual framing of this kind of point, where the idea is that unjust systems will make people rise up against it. But that doesn't mean that because it lasted some length of time that it's actually not that bad. There are any number of unjust governments or systems which are able to perpetuate themselves for long periods of time, and that longevity is not evidence that they were good, actually. The Empire lasted for about 2.5 decades, a length of time that was almost matched by Mussolini's time in office, and if anyone tried to suggest that Mussolini's time in office showed that his regime couldn't actually be that bad, then they're probably someone with a questionable avatar and username posting cringe in this comments section already anyways. Apartheid in South Africa lasted way longer, as did the Atlantic slave trade, and so on and so forth. The second and more obvious point is that this is kind of self-defeating because the Empire only lasted 25 years. It didn't end up sustaining itself, and pretty much the entire time it faced open rebellion. This is followed up by saying, quote, "That means there must have been quite a number of good people working for and with the Empire for a variety of good reasons. I'm sure there was a large faction who fully supported the law and order, if not justice, the Empire brought to a dangerous galaxy. Who doesn't yearn for their loved one's safety and security? You could grant that the Empire brought law and order or safety and security at the expense of justice, and then you have to weigh the pros and cons there, but again, the evidence just isn't there that it did any of that to begin with. The Empire didn't bring security and order. Its oppression caused a galaxy-wide revolt, and the radicalization of Imperials destabilized the galaxy for a long time. They kept trying to ruin stuff because the lack of justice was the thing that many of them found very attractive. So whose loved ones were being made safe exactly? People on Alderaan? Even within the group for whom the Empire explicitly existed to protect their interests at the expense of everyone else, for example, humans of a certain status, you could still find yourself on the receiving end of collective punishment. For others, the Empire didn't even bother with the premise of providing safety and security. Wookiees were enslaved en masse in service of the Imperial war machine. So jumping back to the idea that Cross was just hunting pirates, how many of the people being quote-unquote justly hunted by Cross were pushed to piracy or smuggling because necessary supplies were being either denied or extracted from their communities? Chewbacca's an underworld smuggler who was working for the Hutts, but he's in that position because he was enslaved by the Imperials and then freed by Han. And that brings us to the next paragraph, wherein Randy talks about the better life the Empire offers to people on the fringes of society, on underdeveloped and impoverished worlds. After all, even Luke Skywalker hoped to leave Tatooine by joining the Empire. But that's the thing about colonialism. It's not like these planets were themselves benefiting by joining the Empire economically. In most cases like this, the resources from these fringe planets are hollowed out for the benefit of the metropole, not the colony. A lot of those corrupt Imperial officials that were taking resources from their sectors and giving them away for favors, or just pulling them in for their own benefit, they were only in a position to do that because they had the one quality of expressing support for the Empire, getting sent out to some other planet, and then they were put in charge of extracting these kinds of resources for the benefit of the Empire. That is in fact part of why people like Luke needed to leave their home planets for hope of a better life, and the only way you could do that was to sign yourself over to the oppression machine. So it's kind of weird to present that as if Luke was joining the Empire because what the Empire was doing was good. It's certainly a story about how someone who is an otherwise good person can become complicit in these kinds of things, but it doesn't mean that the Empire is therefore good. The young adult novel Lost Stars in the Disney canon by Claudia Gray does a great job exploring the rationale of these characters for joining the Empire, the impacts the Empire has moving in on a planet, and how that impacts everyone in the story of Lost Stars. And it does this without being a caricature of the Empire or of Imperials either. For some of the characters, they buy into the Empire and they stay bought in despite being asked to do pretty heinous stuff. And this fundamentally gets to what makes me roll my eyes at the idea of Kir Kanos or characters like him as evidence of a morally complex version of Star Wars. Randy ends the piece by saying, if you're one who's inclined to view the political structure in Star Wars as strictly black and white, I urge you to check out one or both of these series and take a walk on the Imperial side. But there's a difference between a story being morally complex, i.e. not just black and white, and a story that's just willing to say there are good Imperials. Kir Kanos is, according to the blurb here, quote, forever a man caught in the middle. Kanos must reconcile his desire to fulfill his oath of vengeance against those he blames for the death of the Emperor, Luke Skywalker and his friends, with his hatred of other Imperials who he feels have corrupted Palpatine's vision of Empire. So while I actually do enjoy Crimson Empire as a comic book, it's not because it's confronting me with some different idea of a good empire. The morality of the people involved is actually one of the least interesting parts of the story, because the approach to this kind of the good Imperial story often treat good or bad as something you are, rather than a summation of the things you do. Kanos, as it explicitly states here, is fully bought into this idea of Palpatine's empire as this good thing, and other Imperials have come along and ruined it, which kind of scapegoats them and claims that there was some better empire before. But if Kanos believes that, then he's kind of an idiot. Like, even earlier in this article, Palpatine is not portrayed as one of the good guys, but once you get to the post-Endor period, you have a lot of these characters like Kanos or Mara, who are portrayed as like supporting the former empire, but now it's just not cool anymore. So in stories like Kir Kanos's, there's not moral ambiguity, there's prescribed moral certainty. Kanos is a good person because he's a good person, ergo what he is doing and serving must have also been good. Doesn't it just blow your mind if you thought the Empire was supposed to be evil? There's never really a point where these kinds of characters are allowed to consider their complicity in a more nefarious system and decide what that actually means. The X-Wing books or the New Jedi Order books are a much better look at what this kind of story can entail, despite the fact that the characters are theoretically serving the good guys. They often wonder if what they're supporting is actually good, and they sometimes leave or threaten to leave if they're called to do something they feel is unjust. I'm not saying these are all stories where the decisions of these characters match some perfect moral good, but they do engage with questioning the morality of their actions rather than just saying, Wedge Antilles is a good guy, and then we can say the New Republic is good by proxy. There's some parallels where they'll say they're supporting the system of the New Republic even if the current government of the day isn't what they support, and you can compare that to someone like Kanos saying they support the Empire but not what these new Imperial remnants are doing. But the fundamentals of the Empire aren't really defensible, and if they try to personify that in Palpatine and say they're supporting Palpatine, that also was never a defensible position either. Instead, it's portrayed more as this kind of personal virtue through either keeping their word and showing a sense of honor, where it's the devotion to that system that makes them a good person. But as this article shows, that's always taken in some attempt to therefore justify the Empire, and that's where things tend to fall apart. But even then, I'd contrast some of what is done with Kir Kanos here and with other attempts to show Imperials as more complex characters elsewhere. In Starfighters of Adamar, Admiral Terran Rogris is having a breakdown over what he feels like is the backslide of the Empire as well. But Rogris talks directly about how his former position used to allow him to do things like deliver medicines and actually accomplish some good, even if that happened within a horrible system. For Kir Kanos, he was Palpatine's bodyguard. He wasn't doing any of that. Putting forward Kanos as the example of the good Imperial just feels like Imperial Apologia rather than an actual morally complex story. I can certainly understand there being stories about Imperial characters within the Empire, and not necessarily needing to condemn the characters on the spot if they don't leave the Empire at the end of the story. But so many of these stories, and the stories that people seem to ask about for Imperials as the good guys, are explicitly rejecting any kind of deeper thought about what makes them good or bad. Instead, we have to be told they're good, they only do good things, and then the Empire gets to be good, even though the entire franchise is about how it's a faction that's rotten to its core. So eventually, those characters do kind of have to come to terms with what they're doing, and that's why there are so many stories about characters who are supposed to be good people leaving the Empire rather than staying within it. It's all very silly. Thank you for watching though, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Remember to like and subscribe for more if you did, and I hope to see you next time.